All right, everyone. So we're at the last part of the video lecture series for Chapter 8. We left off at the strategies for solving ethical dilemmas. Now, this is probably the most important piece of the chapter because it is a set of strategies, not the only set of strategies, but a good sort of starting point for a set of strategies to help us deal with ethical problems, whether those be in the workplace or whether they be in our own personal individual lives. As I said in the previous video lecture, there's 3. Principle-based models is the first one. Number 2 is reflection-based models, and number 3, procedure-based models. So if we look at the first one, what does a ethical practitioner do when pursuing an ethical dilemma using a principle-based model? So we say first that person determines which principles and values they want to live by. And of course, this goes back to another chapter where we referred to having some kind of, personal code of ethics. In the last chapter in particular, where we're looking at what our code of ethics is and how it might sort of cross over or link with, be parallel to an organizational code of ethics. If there is some conflict between those two things, then we can pursue this principle-based model as a sort of starting point strategy. So the first thing, again, we determine which principles and values we want to live by. Then we prioritize them. We put them in order. What's the number one rule that I want to follow as a person? As an example, I'll say, if it's respect, just to sort of start this off, if I consider respect to be my number one value that I want to hold to, whether it be in the workplace or in my personal life, then I can prioritize that as my number one value. And then whatever follows from it, things like patience, that might be another value or principle that I have, standard that I've set for myself. Patience is, as we say, patience is a virtue. We might say, okay, respect, honesty, patience, any 2 or 3 values that we think are important for us or that we want to work on getting better at as ethical practitioners, as moral agents. So we're prioritizing. Again, first step. We might think of this, and I put the example as a moral compass. Here's my moral compass for dealing with issues. And you'll see that my example of respect is a little bit different here. I'm giving you an actual example from somebody where they've prioritized first, second, and third. I'm going to try to always be honest. I'm going to treat everyone with respect. And number 3, I'm going to be compassionate. So how would I apply those within my own personal life? And of course, as it might relate to an ethical dilemma I'm going to face in the workplace. This method is quick and useful in identifying the right course of action, what to do when a scenario or dilemma is presented to me and I have to face it. So if I have these and I'm aware of my own moral compass, then I can use this as a method. Of course, I'm probably going to have to develop or put together a statement of what's going on in the scenario or the dilemma, but then I'm going to run that dilemma through this moral compass and see how the connections can be made before I make my choice, before I make my decision. So that we call principle-based model. The next model that they discuss in the textbook is called reflection-based model. So under this method, if we're ethical practitioners pursuing this type of model for solving ethical dilemmas, we say that this methods of resolving ethical issues is based on personal reflection. And we might say before I act and after I act or I behave in a particular way when the scenario presents itself to me. There's certain things I can do before I act, of course. We call that pre-reflection. And things I can do after in terms of, how can I learn from this? What lesson did I learn from making that choice? That would be post-reflection. So the questions are intended to probe the ethical validity of a particular course of action that's being considered. The more I think about in advance what I'm going to do, what my options are in a given dilemma, the more reflective I am. And that's going to usually prove to be effective. Although it's not the only strategy, it is definitely a good strategy. I say on that slide, if used to resolve an ethical dilemma, the questions might be posed for each possible course of action. I can do this, A, I can do this, B, I can do this, C, and then what are the consequences for each one of those actions? And by consequence, I mean, what are the results, both positive and negative? And before I make that decision, or before I make that choice, I can also ask myself the ethics check questions that you see on the next part of the slides, which are pretty straightforward and easy to comprehend. Number one, is it legal? Is what I'm about to do legal? If it's not legal, or if it's illegal, then that's probably an action that I don't want to engage in, or a behavior, a road that I don't want to take with this particular choice I'm going to have to make. Does it violate any company policies or professional standards? Now, when we think about the law within the organization, we might say that, within an organization, if the organization has principles that we follow, an example might be a harassment policy, right? A harassment in the workplace policy. If I'm going against that harassment policy that my workplace has, then of course I want to choose a different behavior. So we see that these questions ultimately they guide our behavior, but they're based on a model that we call reflective. Next, we say, is it balanced? What are likely consequences? What is going to happen if I do this? What's going to happen? Is it fair to everyone who will be affected? Both in the short term and the long term, I've put there. And then lastly, how will it make me feel about myself? After I make this decision, am I going to be able to live with this decision, or am I going to feel uncomfortable? And of course, we find ourselves in a lot of different situations where we know we shouldn't do something, we choose to do it, and then we feel some form of guilt afterwards. And this would be that sort of example that we're talking about. But we could also think of it as, I'm facing a scenario in my life or within my workplace, and I have this gut feeling, as I've put on your slide, that it's wrong. It's going to be wrong for me to do this. So I want to avert away from that choice. I don't want to make a choice like that. I want to go away from it, and I have a good reason to. And again, we're asking ourselves these questions, and that is proof of reflection in dealing with a dilemma. So far we have that. We have principle-based models, we have reflection-based models, and then now, lastly, we have procedure-based models. This is what I'm going to do step by step. And when I write out these steps sometimes, as some of us are in the habit of doing already, a lot of us adore this sort of method of following a procedure. I'm going to use these this set of procedures to solve this problem. I'm going to document them, and I'm going to, I'll have confidence that what I'm doing, that I've made the right choice. So we say, and I've said this on the slide, resolves ethical dilemmas following a step-by-step process. It's more time-consuming, well, because we have to prioritize. We have to think about what should be on that step-by-step list. And we still have to sort of use our capacity to discern about what the best course of action is. But we're going to develop a model that has steps in it. That's the sort of illuminating ingredient of a procedure-based model. This is usually reserved for more complex dilemmas. Maybe it's in a dilemma that you're facing in the workplace that, occurs over a few months, or could be going on for a year in the workplace. So we commit to a procedure-based model, and this is usually the strategy that is favored when we're dealing with those types of ethical dilemmas. Each step can be documented. Just as an example, if you're writing emails back and forth to people in the resolving of an ethical dilemma, you're keeping track of what those emails tell you. You have documented evidence that, this happened on this day, and here's what the result was as it relates to this bigger problem that I might be dealing with in my workplace. And so following the steps should look something like what I've put in your slide presentation as the steps. And there's, I believe, 6 or 7. There's 7. No, there's more than 7. There's 8 total steps that are followed in a procedure-based model. Not necessarily in this order, but the order that the authors give us for the text in the textbook is the order that I've given you on those slides. So the first thing we do is our fact finding. We research the facts and the background and the context thoroughly, understand what the facts of a situation are before proceeding anywhere. That's that important, number one. Number two, the issue, identifying what the issue is. We examine the ethical issues involved, whether they be personal, systemic, corporate, relevant laws, corporate company policies, professional standards of practice, as many sort of things that we can identify that will give us a better idea of what the issue actually is. If we're talking about discrimination as an example, if I want to be able to identify discrimination in the workplace, I'm going to have to look at all of the company policies that might apply to that. If I feel that I'm being discriminated against, or if a colleague of mine is being discriminated against, or if I'm making a judgment about somebody that is involved in a situation like that. The best way to go about it is to be able to identify what the issue is. Maybe it isn't even discrimination. So these are important pieces of this particular model, the procedure-based model. Next, we identify who's involved, or the stakeholders. Anyone and everyone who will be affected by the outcome of a decision or a choice. Next, number 4, we identify and analyze possible alternatives. We can list, as an example, all the possible courses of action using the SMART strategy that we've covered previously in the course. And you can go back and look at that model as a sort of example to use for this for achieving this end. We say also any practical constraints which could prevent a course of action from being implemented must also be considered. So we're covering all our bases. All of our ducks are in a row, and this is how we're showing that sort of procedure-based model. Next, we evaluate the alternatives, or we look at the options that are available to us to solve the problem. Look at the short-term consequences or results, look at the long-term. This is an important piece. Look at the greater good, which I've said also in that slide. Next, we document the decision. We have to write things down under this method, and I would suggest to all methods it's always a good idea to write things down, because we can better articulate usually what's happening with an issue or an ethical dilemma if we get into the habit of documenting the facts and documenting what we see or what we observe as happening, to be able to show or to be able to help us, assist us in making the best decision. Number 7, implement the chosen action. If possible, discuss the decision with the other stakeholders before we implement it, just like a code of ethics. We would say people have to know about it before we put it out there to everybody. In other words, try not to make it a surprise. Prepare a detailed implementation plan, how we're going to go about putting this in. As a result of this issue in our workplace, now we're going to change things up, and here's how we're going to go forward. And this is using that method, the procedure-based model type method. We consider also how to lessen potential negative impacts and increase anticipated positive impacts, always weighing the negative against the positive. And then lastly, we monitor the outcome. So it's always, just like a code of ethics, useful for us to go back and look at whether or not the decision that we made or the result of a particular scenario is actually working for us. If we've developed a principle around it, is it working? And if it isn't working, we need to go back and sort of acknowledge that it could be changed and think about why we need to change it within the workplace. So that covers all three models that I would suggest. And really, you could also argue that you can have that someone could put together their own strategy for handling an ethical dilemma that has a little bit from each of these models, sort of a hybrid model, if you will. So we have, 4 or 5 different ways to handle ethical dilemmas, and always we say the more avenues of thought that we take before making a decision, the better as ethical practitioners. The last thing I'll draw your attention to has to do with the action plan for ethical decision making, and this is on page 260, 261 of your textbook. There is an interesting chart there for you to look at. There's an exercise for you to complete, which I would suggest is great sort of practice that helps us with this. And, in specific, the exercise 8.8, how to use an action plan, how to put it to use. Consider an ethical dilemma you or someone you know has faced or could be faced with. Write it out, including as many details as possible. Then, using your version of a procedure-based model as an example, or one of the other ones, resolve the dilemma step by step. So you could use any model to solve a problem. And even if you create a fictional example and use a model to try and solve it, this prepares you for when it actually happens out there in your career and in the workplace. So that covers chapter 8. As we've said before, and if not, I'll make it clear now, there is no chapter 9. Although there is one in your textbook, we don't get into talk about chapter 9. You will be looking at a case study in the course, but it's not going to be a case study that's taken from this textbook. So I will see you next week, and we will continue on with the rest of the course. We'll see you then.